Before Elias Grafe ever saw the door in the cliff, he smelled what was waiting behind it. The sea should have smelled of salt, iron, and cold stone, but the wind that came out of the fjord carried something warmer, sweeter, and almost alive. It was the odor of a wound that had learned to breathe. The launch fought the waves head-on, and every blow against the water ran through the hull and into his spine as a dull, aching tremor. Elias Grafe sat on a hard wooden bench under the low stern canopy, the soles of his boots braced against the wet decking, and watched the strip of shore ahead. It had long since stopped looking like shore. Gray water flowed into gray sky with no seam and no horizon, and only the black teeth of the rocks off the port side reminded him that land still existed. October of 1942 revealed itself not through cold, but through smell. It smelled of sea water, salt spray, and something rotting, something organic, blown from the deep throat of the fjord. Grafe breathed it in and thought of the small naval harbor where the launch had taken him aboard 4 hours earlier, the officer mess with unexpectedly tolerable coffee, the handsome eyes of the radio operator who had handed him the packet of papers. All that was behind him now, and ahead waited the black-tide laboratory. He took the order from his breast pocket, though he already knew it by heart. The form of the Reich Security main office, the seal, the sweeping signature of a group leader. Hauptsturmführer Elias Grafe of the SS was instructed to inspect Facility Blacktide, assess the scientific progress of Project Orlia, and determine whether further funding was justified. Then came 3 pages of bureaucratic German, each word carrying the weight of careers, fates, and graves not yet dug. Grafe folded the paper and put it away. A pigskin briefcase filled with blank report forms lay on his knees. He rested both hands on it and closed his eyes. For a man of 32, his face looked older. Not because of wrinkles, there were almost none, but because of the fixed, worn expression that belongs to men who have spent years controlling every movement of their facial muscles. Sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, a chin with a shallow cleft, fair hair brushed back, gray-blue eyes into which the light always fell in the same way, as if a steady, unblinking lamp stood somewhere behind them. His uniform fit well, but without the theatrical elegance of Berlin staff officers. It was simply a carefully tailored shape on a lean, sinewy body. The engine eased down. The launch entered the narrow throat of a side channel. The cliffs closed in so tightly that they seemed to squeeze the vessel from both sides, and the engine noise, reflected off the stone walls, came back tripled. The helmsman, an elderly, unterfled Webel with a face weathered to a dark red, shouted something, but the words drowned in echoes. Grafe stood, took the briefcase in his left hand, and stepped out from beneath the canopy. The pier did not reveal itself at once. It grew out of the rock like a natural continuation of it. A concrete platform set into the stone, with 2 rusted bollards and a half-erased stripe of yellow paint. Higher up in the body of the cliff, a black rectangular opening gaped like the mouth of a mine. Above it, barely visible on the wet granite, a stenciled white inscription showed the code of the facility. 2 men stood by the opening. Grafe recognized the first from the photograph in the dossier. Professor Albrecht Krause, director of the project. Tall, slightly stooped, with a long, narrow face dominated by a massive forehead speckled with age spots. He wore thin steel-framed spectacles. He was 56. Before the war, he had chaired marine biology at the University of Kiel. 3 monographs, 2 translated into English. A party member since 1937, though his party record was more ornamental than devout. His true party and his true religion remained science, or rather that borderland of science where biology touched something for which there was no exact name. The second man was not mentioned in the dossier. Young, short, stocky, with a round pink face and small guarded eyes. A baggy laboratory coat hung on him, and beneath it protruded army trousers tucked into boots. He shifted from foot to foot and rubbed his hands without stopping, whether from cold or nerves. The launch nudged the bollard. A sailor threw a line. Grafe stepped onto the pier, and the soles of his boots slipped on the wet concrete. He caught his balance, adjusted his footing, and straightened. "Welcome," Krause said, extending his hand. Grafe shook it briefly, without warmth. "Professor," he said, "thank you for meeting me." Hopsturmfura Grafe, Kraus replied quickly, almost breathless, as if his thoughts were outrunning his words. It is an honor. Allow me to introduce my first assistant, Dr. Niels Vogt. Niels is indispensable in the laboratory. Vogt nodded hurriedly. His handshake was damp and weak. Hopsturmfura, he murmured. Welcome. Grafe looked at them both, and his gaze rested on Kraus a little longer than courtesy required. My time is limited, Professor. The Reichsführer is waiting for results. I would like to begin at once. Of course, please follow me. They entered the airlock. The steel door closed behind them with a soft pneumatic sigh, and silence dropped all at once, like a mass of water. The roar of the fjord, the wind, the slap of waves, all of it was cut away. Only the quiet breathing of ventilation remained, and a distant electrical hum at the edge of hearing. The corridor sloped downward at an angle of 10 or 15 degrees. The walls were raw concrete, unplastered, with wet streaks in the joints between slabs. At regular intervals, lamps burned in wire cages beneath the ceiling, and their yellow sickly light laid hard shadows across faces. The floor of ribbed metal answered hollowly beneath their heels. The complex was built by a sapper battalion of the TOT organization in the beginning of 1941, Kraus explained as they walked. His voice moved nearer and farther away, as if he kept forgetting he was walking beside a guest. There are 3 levels. The upper level is administrative and residential. The middle level contains the main laboratories. The lower level is the interesting one, Hopsturmfura. It has direct access to an underwater cavern, a natural formation. We merely widen the passage. That is where we obtain the initial biological material. How deep? The cavern descends more than 40 meters below sea level. The colonies of primary interest are found at depths between 20 and 30 meters. The diving team works daily. They pass through another sealed door and reach the middle level. Here the corridor widened, and side branches led off from it behind heavy doors marked with sector numbers. The air changed. Into the sterile chill of the ventilation mixed another odor, sweetish, heavy, like iodine, and at the same time like something living and warm, like the smell of freshly cut liver. Grafe noted it, but his face did not move. Kraus pushed open a double door and led him inside. This way, please. The main laboratory occupied a room the size of a small factory workshop. The ceiling was low and oppressive. Along the left wall stretched worktables littered with glassware, racks of test tubes, notebooks, and coils of wire. On the right stood instruments that Grafe did not entirely recognize. A centrifuge, a microscope with binocular head, an autoclave, and something large under a tarpaulin. But it was not the equipment that drew the eye. It was the aquariums. 7 of them stood along the far wall, each the size of a wardrobe. Thick glass, steel frames, systems of tubes for water intake and drainage. Inside, in clouded water with a greenish tint, creatures moved. Grafe stepped closer. In the first aquarium, something like an enormous isopod lay on the bottom, except that its body was as long as a grown man. The chitin segments of its shell shone with dull mother-of-pearl. Antennae, thin and long as horsehair, continuously felt along the glass. In the second aquarium, jellyfish drifted. Not the transparent bells one might see near the Baltic coast, but dense fleshy things with domes the size of soup plates and bunches of tentacles trailing beneath them. Each body pulsed with a soft, barely noticeable bluish glow, as if a wick smoldered inside it. In the third aquarium, Grafe did not immediately understand what he was looking at. A shapeless mass of gray tissue, coated in mucus, rolled slowly along the bottom. At times something resembling a limb or tendril slid out of it, felt the space, and withdrew again. A chimera, Kraus explained, noticing his doubtful glance. A result of spontaneous hybridization among several species found in the cavern. We have not yet classified it. It has properties which, however, I am getting ahead of myself. He led Grafe to the central laboratory table. On it, inside a glass container with a ground lid, stood a cylindrical vessel made of thick borosilicate glass. Something was inside. Grafe bent closer and studied it. A viscous fluid with the consistency of aspic or dense fish glue filled 2/3 of the vessel. Its color shifted with the angle of vision, now cloudy gray, now bluish white, with an inner shimmer like the pearly glint on scales. The substance was not motionless. It flowed slowly inside the vessel, almost imperceptibly as if it were breathing. "This is the foundation of Project Orlia," Cross said. He removed his spectacles, wiped them and put them back on. "Regenerative biomaterial. We isolated it from the tissues of deep-sea organisms inhabiting the cavern. Jellyfish of the genus Turritopsis, giant isopods, and several species of polychaetes with abnormal regenerative properties. Through enzymatic hydrolysis and subsequent centrifugation, we obtained a concentrate containing a unique complex of peptides and mucopolysaccharides. They stimulate cell division with an efficiency unmatched in known science." He was speaking now like a lecturer, like a preacher, and the pink spots on his forehead darkened with blood. "Turritopsis nutricula is capable of cellular transdifferentiation," he continued. "In essence, it can reverse aging at the cellular level. Wild specimens are too small and unstable, but the forms we found in the cavern are significantly larger than their known relatives, and their regenerative potential exceeds anything described in the literature. We have learned to extract the active components, concentrate them, and create a preparation capable of initiating regeneration in damaged mammalian tissue." "Show me," Grafe said. Cross nodded to Vogt. The assistant rolled a prepared projector from behind a screen and unrolled the canvas. Black and white images flickered, shot on 16mm film. A rabbit fixed to an operating table, the left side shaved. A straight incision in the skin, about 7 centimeters long. Deep with spread edges, muscle visible beneath. A hand in a rubber glove applied a gray-blue ointment to the wound with a glass rod. The camera showed a chronometer on the wall. Grafe watched. After 14 minutes by the clock, the edges of the wound began to draw together. Not as a human cut heals, with the slow contraction of granulation tissue, but differently. Quickly, evenly, almost mechanically. New tissue grew over the exposed muscle in a smooth pink layer, and a minute later fine white hairs appeared on it. Next scene. A rat with the right hind paw amputated. The stump treated with the preparation and bandaged, accelerated footage. In the corner of the frame, a counter of hours ran forward. At the 6th hour, a swelling appeared at the stump. By the 12th, it had taken the shape of a limb with distinct phalanges. By the 18th, the rat was cautiously stepping on the new paw. The film ended. The screen flashed white. "The rate of regeneration depends on the concentration of the preparation and the area of damage," said a young woman from behind a work table, whom Grafe had not noticed until that moment. He turned. She had been sitting on a tall stool before a microscope, hidden by equipment, and had evidently kept working through the demonstration. Now she stood and came closer, wiping her hands with a piece of gauze. About 25, short and slender chestnut hair pulled into a tight knot at the back of her head, a narrow face with high cheekbones and slightly hollow cheeks. Shadows of sleeplessness lay under her eyes. The coat hung on her like on a wire hanger, and a pencil protruded from the breast pocket. "Mara Lind," Cross introduced her. "My second assistant, biomechanist, specialist in histology. Fraulein Lind keeps all documentation on the experiments." She extended her hand. Grafe took it. Her fingers were hard, with rough pads and short, unevenly cut nails. "Hauptsturmführer," she said, looking directly at him without the restless fussiness that marked Vogt. "If you are interested in quantitative data, I can provide the journals. We keep records on every specimen." Cross clasped his hands behind his back and rocked on his heels. The expression that crossed his face was that of a lecturer interrupted by a student in the back row. "Certainly," Grafe replied. "But first I would like to hear about the side effects." A short pause. Cross and Vogt exchanged a glance. Mara did not look away from Grafe. "There are side effects," she answered evenly, "and they are significant." "Mara," Cross interrupted softly, "let us not draw hasty conclusions, Hauptsturmführer. We are speaking of secondary adaptive changes, a natural accompaniment to so radical a biological process. Nothing critical." "I want to see the test subjects," Grafe said. His voice did not change. He did not insist, did not demand. He simply stated that he wanted to see them, and in that tone there was no space left for refusal. "Very well, then, this way." Cross led him to the vivarium. Carefully here, please do not strike your head. The vivarium was in the adjoining room, separated from the laboratory by a vestibule with double doors. Here the smell was different, concentrated and dense. Live urine, raw meat and the same sweet iodine note, only multiplied many times. Cages stood in 2 rows. Rabbits, rats, 2 cats. Most looked normal if one did not look closely, but Grafe looked closely. The rabbit from the film, the one with the healed wound in its side, sat in the corner of its cage with its muzzle turned to the wall. A carrot and cabbage leaf placed in the feeder remained untouched. Fur grew normally over the healed wound, but beneath it, where the coat parted slightly, the skin shone with a pale, unnatural luster. When Grafe bent near the bars, the rabbit did not turn. It did not move at all. Only its ears, pressed back, trembled faintly from time to time. The rat with the restored paw occupied a lower cage. It moved in circles rhythmically without stopping like a wound mechanism. The new paw functioned, but it looked different from the other 3. A little longer, a little thinner, with joints that bent at the wrong angles. The skin on it had no fur and was covered by a wet film, gleaming in the lamplight. Tissue compatibility has not been fully achieved, Cross commented. The new limb forms from precursor cells that differentiate under the influence of the preparation, but the morphogenetic program does not always reproduce the original architecture with precision. She does not eat, Mara said. Cross shot her a brief, irritated look but remained silent. She stood just behind him with her arms crossed, and his displeasure plainly did not touch her. For 4 days now. Body temperature has fallen 1.5 degrees below normal. She seeks the coldest parts of the cage and wedges herself into the corner where the ventilation pipe runs. Grafe straightened. Mortality among test animals. 17%, Mara answered before the professor could open his mouth. Of 23 treated animals, 4 died. 3 showed necrosis in areas not adjacent to the application site. 1 developed a systemic reaction. Allergic in nature, Cross cut in, no longer hiding his irritation at the talkative assistant. Anaphylaxis. Normal losses for an experimental phase. Grafe did not answer. He was looking at the cat in the far cage. A large, gray, long-haired cat that had probably once belonged to someone on the staff. On its right foreleg, just above the wrist, was a ring of altered skin, wet, smooth, with the same pearly sheen. The cat lay on its side and breathed slowly, very slowly, with intervals that seemed too long for a living creature. Its eyes did not blink. The pupils were dilated to their limit, and in them something cloudy seemed frozen. He turned away. I need all journals, all protocols, including rejected inventory sheets on reagent consumption, the ventilation scheme of the facility and emergency isolation protocols for the sectors. By evening, Cross went pale but nodded. Elias Grafe worked late into the evening. He was given a cramped office on the upper level with a desk, a cot and a table lamp whose shade cast a circle of hard yellow light. Beyond the circle, darkness began, and only the corners of the walls emerged from it. He read page after page, notebook after notebook. Craw's hand, broad and confident, alternated with Mara's careful notes, small angular letters with the characteristic German ligatures. Vogt wrote rarely and badly. His notes amounted to technical marks about autoclave pressure, centrifuge temperature, and sample exposure times. The scientific part left no doubt. Cross was not lying and not exaggerating, at least not in matters of fact. The preparation truly possessed regenerative properties unlike anything known. The extract from the tissues of a deep-sea jellyfish species not yet described in zoological literature contained a complex of low molecular peptides, each of which separately stimulated cell division, and together triggered a cascade of reactions that formed new tissue where damaged tissue had been. The mechanism resembled embryonic development, but with one crucial difference. The new tissue did not always reproduce the original. It was different. In Mara's journal, Grafe found an entry dated the 4th of September, underlined in red pencil. Sample K14, male rabbit, 3.2 kilograms. Treatment with RBM at 4% concentration applied to a lacerated wound of the left thigh. Wound closed completely in 22 minutes. On the 5th day, skin in the regeneration zone lost pigmentation and became translucent. vascular network of atypical configuration visible beneath skin. On the 8th day, subject refused food and preferred darkness. Response to light absent. Response to sound delayed. On the 12th day, nodules were found in the application zone. Histology showed structures morphologically resembling chitin plates integrated into the dermis. On the 15th day, subject found dead. Autopsy revealed extensive infiltration of internal organs by unidentified biomaterial structurally similar to jellyfish mesoglea. Grafe read the last sentence twice, then closed the notebook, leaned back in the chair, and spent several minutes looking into the darkness beyond the circle of light. There was a knock at the door. "Come in, Mara." She brought a mug of coffee and a folder of documents. "The inventory sheets you requested," she said, placing the folder on the edge of the desk. "The coffee is only half real, unfortunately, chicory with barley." "Thank you." He took the mug and sipped. Bitter, warm, almost flavorless. Mara stood in the half-circle of lamplight, and the shadows lay differently on her face than by day, softer, concealing some of the exhaustion. A strand of hair had escaped the tight knot and touched her neck. Grafe noticed it and at once lowered his eyes to the papers. She did not leave. She remained by the door. On her face a struggle was taking place, and Grafe observed it with professional attention. She wanted to say something. She was afraid. She was deciding. "Hauptsturmführer, I am listening." "Professor Cross did not show you the lower level." "I know." She flinched slightly, blinking. Color rose to her cheeks. "You know. I noticed that the ventilation plan given to me contains no circuit serving Sector F. That sector is absent from every plan I have seen. But on the electrical panel of the middle level there are breakers marked F1, F2, and F3. What is in Sector F?" Fraulein Lind. She swallowed. "Subjects who were not included in the report." "What subjects?" "People." Silence. The steady hum of ventilation. The distant sound of water dripping from the ceiling somewhere in the corridor. "Sit down," Grafe said. She obeyed and sat on the edge of the cot, hands clasped on her knees. Her fingers whitened with tension. "Now tell me." Mara began to speak, and her voice sounded dull and monotonous, like a person recounting someone else's dream, trying not to claim it as her own. Human experiments had begun in August. Professor Cross had received permission, or perhaps he had not. She did not know for certain. 6 prisoners from the Grini camp had been brought to the laboratory, Norwegian political prisoners, 2 women and 4 men. They were housed in Sector F on the lower level, in cells fitted like wards. The first 3 trials were carried out under a cautious scheme, the same as with animals. Local application of diluted preparation to artificially inflicted wounds, cuts, burns, and contusion injuries. Regeneration in humans proceeded even faster than in rabbits. One man, a 30-year-old fisherman from Bergen named Arvid Sahlberg, had the skin and muscle of his forearm cut down to the bone. The wound closed in 7 minutes, but the side effects appeared more quickly as well. By the 2nd day, the skin in the treated area had become transparent. Not merely pale, but truly transparent, like frosted glass. Muscle fibers were visible through it, and they too had changed. From red-brown they had turned gray-blue with a wet sheen. He stopped sleeping. He did not complain of insomnia. He simply lay with open eyes and stared at the ceiling. He answered questions, but with a growing delay, as if words reached him through a thick layer of water. On the 4th day he refused food. On the 5th he asked for the lights to be turned off. On the 6th he stopped speaking. On the 7th, clear mucus began to seep from beneath his nails, stretching in thin threads to the walls and sticking there in a web-like pattern. Cross was delighted, Mara said. In her voice sounded a level, controlled hatred. He records observations. He speaks of an evolutionary leap and an expansion of biological boundaries. He does not see these people as people. He sees material. What about the others? 2 received injections of higher concentration under the skin of the abdomen. One of them. She stopped and squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them again. One of the women, her name was Ng Hell, began screaming a day after the injection. Not from pain, from something else. She said she could feel something moving inside her, something crawling over her organs. She said it was warm and wet and that it was looking for her. Then she stopped screaming. Then she stopped speaking. Then her nails began to lift away and her teeth began to fall out. Mara fell silent. Her hands trembled on her knees. Enough, Grafe said, raising a hand. She looked at him, and in her eyes he read neither pleading nor hysteria but the cold, calculating, desperate look of a person who has no options left except one. Hauptsturmführer, I understand that you are here to evaluate the project. I understand that I am a small person, but this must be shut down, not because it is immoral, though it is, because it is dangerous. The preparation is unstable. Cross does not control the process. He does not understand what he is triggering. Neither does he, nor I, nor anyone on this planet can yet predict what exposure will do to a human organism. We are playing with something we do not know. Grafe was silent. His face remained the same as it had been 4 hours earlier when he stepped onto the pier. Still, even closed. Mara could not know what was happening inside. No one could. I will take this into consideration, he said at last, nodding slowly. Tomorrow morning I will inspect the sector personally. Mara nodded too, stood and left, closing the door quietly behind her. Grafe finished the coffee without haste, set the mug on the chair and sat motionless for a long time, listening to water drip in the corridor. Morning came without dawn. In the rock, day and night could not be told apart. Only the clock on the corridor wall showed 7, and somewhere above, a diesel generator thundered to life for the day shift. Grafe went to breakfast in the officers' mess. A tiny room with 3 tables and a slate board on which someone had written the day menu in chalk. Oatmeal, bread, margarine, coffee. He sat at the end table and ate slowly, chewing the tasteless porridge with care. The spoon struck the wall of the tin bowl in an even rhythm. At the next table sat one of the technicians, a silent man with hands visibly burned by acid, drinking coffee and staring at the wall. They exchanged no words. Cross appeared at 8. He looked excited. His forehead shone with sweat, though the lower levels were steadily cool. Hauptsturmführer, he said, sitting beside the table without asking permission. I must show you something. Urgently. What exactly? The night measurements. Bioactivity in the main reservoir has risen by 40% in the last 12 hours. Spectrophotometry shows the absorption peak shifting into the ultraviolet range. This can mean only one thing. The substance is entering a phase of increased reactivity. If we administer an injection of heightened concentration now, we may see complete transformation. Full transition. Transition into what? Into a new form. Cross leaned forward. Behind the lenses, his eyes seemed enlarged like an insect's eyes. We stand on the threshold, Hauptsturmführer. All the intermediate stages, pigment loss, connective tissue transformation, replacement of cellular membranes. This is not degradation. It is metamorphosis, like a larva becoming a butterfly. We must let the process complete itself. You propose to inject a lethal dose of the preparation into a living human being. I understand you correctly. I propose to carry the experiment to its logical end, Cross said, straightening. In his voice rang a high, clear note that Grafe had heard before in men of a certain kind. Fanatics, madmen, and those who had stopped distinguishing one from the other. The subject is no longer human in the traditional sense. He is in a transitional state. To deny him completion of the metamorphosis is like killing a chrysalis before letting it open its wings. No, the word fell short and dry. Hauptsturmführer. I said no, Professor. Until the inspection is complete, there will be no new experiments. That is an order. Cross froze. His mouth opened and closed. A vein pulsed in his neck above the collar of his tunic. I obey, he said at last, each syllable costing him visible effort. Grafe nodded and returned to his porridge. By 10, he had descended to the laboratory and demanded a demonstration of the procedure for preparing a working solution from the concentrate. Vogt, who was assigned to demonstrate, sweated and trembled. His short fingers in latex gloves shook as he removed a glass ampule of concentrated preparation from the refrigerated cabinet. A 1:10 dilution, he muttered, drawing solution into a graduated pipette. Physiological sodium chloride solution, 0.9%. Mixing on a magnetic stirrer for 3 minutes at room temperature. What is the maximum concentration at which controlled effects have been recorded? Grafe asked. 1:10. At higher concentrations, spontaneous aggregation of peptides begins. The preparation loses fluidity and behaves unpredictably. The young man swallowed audibly. Professor Cross believes it is not a problem but a property. I am not sure. Temperature dependence. Below 4 degrees Celsius, the preparation enters an inert state and crystallizes. When heated above 37, reactivity increases sharply. At body temperature, 36.6, it is most active. That is why the subjects seek cold, Mara said from the doorway. She stood leaning her shoulder against the frame. Their organisms are instinctively trying to slow the process. Cross clicked his tongue almost inaudibly without turning around, but this time he said nothing, and Vogt lowered his eyes to the test tube. Grafe looked at the ampule of concentrate. The viscous liquid glimmered faintly in the glass cylinder. It seemed to respond to his gaze, the shimmer becoming slightly stronger, more rhythmic when he bent closer. But of course that was an optical illusion. Refraction of light in borosilicate glass when the viewing angle changed. Of course. He straightened. I need access to Sector F. Professor Cross, who had been standing apart and pretending to study entries in a journal, turned. He did not feign surprise at Grafe's knowledge of the closed sector. Only the vein in his neck twitched and his glance darted toward Mara. He paused for a second as if weighing whether to pretend ignorance and quickly abandoned the idea. After breakfast, he had already given himself away by requesting permission. Of course. Vogt, the keys. The 4 of them descended. Cross first, then Grafe, then Mara. Vogt came last, looking back every third step as if expecting someone to follow. The stairwell ran steeply down. The steps were damp, covered with a thin layer of something slippery. Vogt slipped once, caught the railing, and swore under his breath. Cross did not even turn. On one landing, Mara brushed Grafe's shoulder in the tight stairwell. She apologized quietly. He nodded without looking, but caught the smell of coarse soap and something floral, barely detectable in her hair. The lower level. The corridor was narrower and lower than above. The walls were not entirely concrete, but partly rock, roughly hewn with veins of quartz showing through. The floor was covered by a thin layer of water, 3 centimeters at most, and the water glittered strangely in the lamplight. It did not merely reflect light. It seemed to contain a faint light of its own. Cross unlocked the sector door with practiced ease and entered as if returning home. He even straightened and set his shoulders back, like a man stepping into a favorite study after a long absence. Subject F1, Arvid Sahlberg, he said, stopping at the first cell and opening the viewing slit. 14th day. Progress stable. Grafe looked in. Arvid lay on the cot on his back, stretched to his full length. Eyes open, arms at his sides, palms up. The skin of his hands, neck and face had lost the color and texture of living tissue. It had become smooth, wet and translucent, like the skin of cave ohms, blind salamanders from underground lakes. Beneath it showed a network of vessels, but the vessels glowed very faintly with the same bluish shimmer as the substance in the vessel upstairs. From beneath the nails, as Mara had described, threads of mucus stretched out. They covered the wall by the head of the bed and part of the ceiling with a fine, almost weightless net, like a cobweb but wet and faintly pulsing. His body still kept its outlines. Shoulders, rib cage, arms, and legs could still be recognized. A human silhouette, though altered, softened like a wax figure in a heated room. He was not yet what he could become. Not yet. Complete loss of cutaneous pigment, Cross commented in a businesslike tone. Replacement of dermal tissue by a mesoglial analog. Notice the extremities, Hauptstammführer. The phalanges have lengthened by 30, perhaps 35%. Interdigital membranes are forming. Respiration has slowed to 4 breaths per minute, but there is no oxygen deprivation. The subject has shifted to cutaneous gas exchange like an amphibian. Is he alive at all? Grafe asked. He exists, Cross replied, and satisfaction sounded in his voice. Those are different things, Professor. That depends on the definition of life. They moved to the second cell. Here Cross hesitated for the first time. He opened the slit, looked, and closed it quickly. The fingers holding the cover whitened at the knuckles. Subject F3, 20th day. Unfortunately, injection of heightened concentration caused disorganization. Open the cell, Grafe ordered after looking through the slit as well. Hauptstammführer, I would not recommend. Open it. Vogt, after receiving Cross' reluctant nod, slid the bolt back with trembling hands. The door swung open. The smell struck first. Not rot. Rot has a recognizable character, however revolting. Protein breakdown, bacterial work. This smelled different. Raw flesh, see depth, something alive and at the same time alien. The smell of a warm jellyfish thrown on shore. The smell of a creature inside out. What lay on the floor of the cell had no shape. A mass about 1.5 square meters across and 10 centimeters thick, gelatinous, translucent, with a bluish glow rising from somewhere inside. Denser structures were visible within it, remnants that had once been bones, now softened and bent as if pulled from a skeleton and dropped into warm gelatin. Bubbles slowly appeared and vanished on the surface, each with a soft, barely audible click. In one place near the center, something contracted rhythmically. A heart, a fragment of intestine, or something with no name in human anatomy. The subject received 5 times the therapeutic dose, Cross said, and his voice was almost apologetic. Morphological collapse was too rapid, the skeletal system failed. But observe, the mass is alive. It responds to light, to vibration. Individual cellular structures retain function. This is not death. This is a man you turned into slime, Grafe said through tightened lips. Cross removed his spectacles and began wiping them. His hands trembled, not with fear or shame, but with excitement. The dosage requires refinement, he murmured. If I were given another 2 months and larger supplies of initial material. The remaining cells, Grafe interrupted. He inspected the third cell on the left through the viewing slit. Hell sat in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, rocking. Her body had changed. The shoulders had softened and become sloping. Her arms from elbows to hands were covered in transparent skin. The fingers had lengthened, the joints had softened, and the hands had taken on a strange flowing shape, as though there were less bone and more cartilage in them. On the backs of the hands, small knobs protruded, and from some of them clear fluid oozed. Her face still held human features, but they seemed blurred, losing definition. The nose had smoothed, the lips had thinned and gone pale. The eyes remained in place, but the whites had turned milky gray, and the pupils had become narrow horizontal slits. She seemed to sense that she was being watched. Her mouth opened. A sound came out, a weak crushed whisper like wet sand rustling. Through the iron door, Grafe made out the words, "Cold, so cold." Grafe stepped back from the slit. In the 4th and 5th cells he found bodies. One already motionless, changed into a gelatinous mass covering the entire floor and part of the walls. The other still showed signs of life, but was so far from human form that age or sex could not be determined. It lay on its side, curled, and from what had once been its back grew thin, translucent threads stretching toward the ceiling like roots of a plant turned upside down. The threads quivered faintly. The body emitted a low sound, continuous and monotonous, like a wire humming in wind. The 6th cell was empty. Mucus stains remained on the floor and grooves scratched by nails. The grooves ran from the cot to the door in parallel lines, as if a person had crawled, gripping the concrete, scraping until the nails broke. In several grooves, Grafe noticed dark dried flecks, blood and something else, yellowish with a pearly sheen mixed with clumps of hair. Subject F8 died on the 9th day, Cross explained, catching his look. Rejection. The organism did not accept the preparation. Massive internal hemorrhage. Body disposed of. How exactly? Grafe asked. The professor faltered and rubbed the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger. Released into the cavern lake, he said at last. The colony utilizes organic matter. Close the cell, Grafe ordered. He stood another second, looking at the bloody traces. Then he turned and met Mara's eyes. She stood by the wall with her fist pressed to her lips. Nothing needed to be said. They returned upward. Vogt came last, constantly wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. On the stairs he slipped again and this time fell, striking his knee. He stood, swore, and limped on. No one helped him and no one turned around. Back in the laboratory, Cross stopped by the aquarium with the jellyfish and stood half a minute, looking at the pulsing bells behind the glass. Then he spoke without turning, quietly, almost to himself. "You think I am a monster, Hauptsturmführer. I see it in your face, though you control it better than most people I have met. You saw the cells and passed judgment. That is natural, but allow me to say something. Those people down there were condemned to die. They would have rotted in a camp from typhus, from hunger, from a bullet to the back of the head. I gave them a chance, not for life in the old sense. No, for existence, for continuation. Turritopsis is immortal. It reverses aging. It returns to the polyp stage and begins again, again, and again. What is happening to my subjects is not destruction. It is the start of a new cycle. They do not die. They cease to be human, but they continue to be. He turned. There was no madness on his face, no malice. There was something far more frightening. Sincerity. You do not see the difference between existence and life, Professor Grafe said. That is what makes you dangerous. Cross straightened sharply. His face darkened. The age spots on his forehead filled with blood, becoming burgundy islands on pale skin. Dangerous, he repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it insulting. You speak of danger to me, to the man who holds the future of the German soldier in his hands. Imagine it, Hauptsturmführer. Imagine an infantryman whose face has been half torn away by shrapnel. 20 minutes after the preparation is applied, he is back in the line. Jaw restored, eye in place. He sees, he breathes, he fires. Imagine a tanker burned to the bone inside his vehicle. In an hour his skin is pink as a newborn child. In 2 hours he climbs back into the tank. He stepped closer to Grafe, and the lenses of the spectacles still in his hand flashed in the lamplight. This is not merely regeneration. It is a shield for the whole Reich, an army that knows no losses from wounds, soldiers who return from hospital not in months but in hours. The Führer will receive what every commander in history has dreamed of, an almost invulnerable army. And you stand here discussing the difference between existence and life, like a university philosopher at a seminar. He caught his breath. The fingers clutching the spectacles whitened. Longevity, Hauptsturmführer. This is not merely extending life by 5 or 10 years. Turritopsis does not age, it reverses the process. If we complete this research, we will give the German people what no civilization in human history has achieved. We will stop the biological clock, the leadership of the Reich, the best minds of the nation, the best warriors. They will live as long as necessary, not years, not decades. Do you understand what that means? It means the 1,000-year Reich in the literal sense. Not metaphor, not a slogan on a poster. Reality. He fell silent. His breathing was fast and broken, as if he had been running. The laboratory was quiet, broken only by the soft bubbling of aquarium filters and the distant hum of ventilation. Mara stood aside by a work table with her arms crossed. Her expression left no doubt about what she thought of every word the professor had said. Grafe allowed the pause to hold, then said quietly, without expression, like a man stating the temperature of the air. Your rabbit has not eaten for 9 days, Professor. Your fisherman from Bergen is covered in mucus and stopped speaking on the 7th day. The woman named in G feels something crawling inside her. Is that your shield for the Reich? Kraus blinked. Then he put on the spectacles he had been holding and walked silently to his desk. By noon, Grafe announced that he wanted to inspect the lower cavern, the place where the initial biomaterial was harvested. The descent took 20 minutes. A narrow passage cut into the rock led almost vertically downward, here and there becoming metal ladders with gridded steps, wet and slippery. The air changed with every meter. It grew heavier, saltier, more saturated with the same sweet organic odor that above had been only a hint. Only Kraus descended with Grafe. Vogt refused, citing his bruised knee. Mara remained in the laboratory. The cavern opened suddenly like a hall behind a door. The flashlight beam struck a stone vault covered with growths like melted icicles, then slid downward to the surface of water. An underground lake, or rather a hollow in the rock flooded by seawater. By 50 by 30 meters. The water was black, still and thick. Beneath its surface, at a depth impossible to judge in darkness, lights glimmered. Not reflected flashlight beams, but light of their own. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of faint bluish points drifting slowly in the deep, like stars in a night sky if the sky were liquid and inverted. The colony, Kraus said beside him, and his face lit from below by reflections from the water looked unrecognizable. We have still not established its boundaries. Divers reached 30 meters. Beyond that the cavern narrows and apparently leads out into the open sea. Jellyfish and isopods, polychaetes and several species we cannot assign to any known type. A closed ecosystem, perhaps thousands of years old, isolated from the rest of the ocean, evolved in complete darkness. And you draw raw material from it. Divers collect samples daily. Jellyfish tissue, mucus from the walls, fragments of organisms. All of it is processed in the laboratory. Concentrate yield is low, about 5 cubic centimeters from 100 kilograms of raw biomass. The quality. Grafe was barely listening. He was looking at the water. At the surface near the shore, in the strip of his flashlight, something moved. Slow, smooth, as if someone beneath the water had extended a hand and withdrawn it. Rings spread across the oily surface, and with them came the smell. Thick, warm, almost tangible. The smell of living innards. One of the glowing points rose from the depths and stopped just below the surface. It became clear that it was not a point but a shape blurred by water. Recognizable all the same. The bell of a jellyfish, large, about 50 centimeters across, with long tentacles trailing down. The body pulsed, and its glow changed in a rhythm Grafe had already heard in the night through the floors. The same slow, even rhythm, like a heartbeat. "They sense us," he said. "Yes," Cross answered, and something like tenderness entered his voice. "Apparently so." They stood on a stone ledge above the water, and Cross spoke of the first dive. Of a diver named Lawrence Haber who surfaced white as chalk, and for 3 days could not speak coherently. Of how the jellyfish approached the divers and hung around them, glowing and pulsing as if studying intruders. Of how one brushed a tentacle against the bare hand of a technician changing a hose, and the technician did not pull away, but froze and watched as small scars and cracks on the back of his hand, marks from working with reagents, smoothed out. For 2 weeks he looked at that hand, Cross said. Showed it to everyone, smooth, pink, like a child hand. He said it was the first time in 10 years the hand did not hurt. Then he asked permission to descend again. I allowed it. He placed both hands in the water and held them there for 4 minutes. All the calluses came away. The skin became soft, and then his nails began to split on the 3rd day. On the 5th he woke and could not bend his fingers. The joints had hardened. We took an X-ray. The connective tissue was being replaced by something similar in density to coral. Where is he now? In Tromsø, in hospital, discharged as disabled. Both hands amputated at the wrists. Cross said it so calmly that Grafe for a moment thought he had misheard. Then he understood that he had not. They climbed back in silence. The catastrophe occurred at 4 in the afternoon. By then, Grafe had already built a complete picture. He knew the layout of all sectors. He knew where the reserves of concentrate were stored in the cryogenic room at -20. He knew that the emergency sector locks operated by mechanical shutters independent of electricity. He knew that the main power panel stood on the middle level at the end of the corridor behind an unlocked grill. He knew that canisters of ethyl alcohol and acetone used for washing equipment were stored in the closet beside the laboratory. 8 canisters of 20 liters each. He knew that the facility staff numbered 23 people, including guards, technicians, and divers, and that 6 of them were currently on the upper level. He knew everything he needed to know, and all that data would soon travel upward. That, in fact, was why Elias Grafe had come. To see what was inaccessible, then report, compose the document, and feed it into the machinery above. He found the unexpected thing when he came down to the laboratory after lunch. The laboratory itself was empty except for Mara, who stood at the entrance to Sector F with the expression people have when they stand before closed doors and hear something behind them they do not want to hear. "He is below," she said, with Vogt. "They went down 20 minutes ago." Cross carried syringes and an ampule. I tried to stop him. He told me that if I did not move away from the door, he would call the guard and lock me in one of the cells. He said that, exactly, word for word. Grafe asked no more questions. He passed her, opened the door into Sector F, and began to descend. Mara hurried after him. They found Cross in cell F1. The door stood open. Vogt was in the corridor, leaning against the wall, his face the characteristic gray-green color of a man close to fainting. He held an empty ampule and stared at it as if at a grenade with the pin pulled. The professor stood over Arvid. One syringe, a 20 cubic centimeter record, was already empty and lay on the floor at his feet. He held the second in his right hand, its needle buried in Arvid's thigh. The Norwegian body still kept human contours. Translucent wet skin stretched over recognizable outlines of muscle and bone. The face, though altered, remained a face. Cheekbones, line of jaw, hollows of eye sockets could still be read. The needle entered the thigh tissue, and that tissue, strange though it was, not quite alive in the familiar sense, was still dense enough to hold the needle. Not pulp yet, not jellyfish yet. Still a man, though at the very edge. "Professor," Grafe said, "put down the syringe and leave the cell." Cross did not move. The thumb of his right hand rested on the plunger, ready to press. 1 minute, Hauptsturmführer. Only one. Grafe stepped to the threshold of the cell and pointed down the corridor, toward the steel door behind which the shapeless gelatinous mass lay on the floor of cell F3. "You want a German soldier to look like that. 1.5 square meters of jelly on a concrete floor. There is your invulnerable warrior." Cross went pale but did not remove his finger from the plunger. "F3 received 5 times the dose," he said quickly. "A gross calibration error, I admit it. But Arvid is ready." 14 days of adaptation. His tissues accepted the preparation. Without further experiments, we will never know where the boundary lies between collapse and completed metamorphosis. I need data. Close the project now and everything we have learned will die. Put down the syringe. That is an order. The professor looked down at Arvid's body, and his face took on an expression in which stubbornness mixed with a painful tenderness. "I will prove it to you now," he whispered. "You will see it with your own eyes." The syringe plunger went down. Undiluted concentrate entered Arvid's body. For the first 3 seconds, nothing happened. On the 4th, the body shuddered. Not a convulsion, not a reflex, but a wave passing from thigh to head and back again, like a ripple over the surface of a pond. The mucus threads covering the walls and ceiling of the cell tightened until they seemed ready to sing. The glow, once weak and even sharply intensified, became pulsing and bright, and the cell filled with bluish shimmer that made wet shadows dance on the walls. Cross stepped back, pressing the used syringe to his chest. His face held an expression of ecstatic expectation. The body on the cot began to change shape. The contours dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Limbs lost their length and pulled into the torso, which at the same time spread outward, flooding the cot, spilling from its edges onto the floor. The head, the last part to retain any human form, slowly sagged and became an uneven mound on the surface of the widening mass. Eyes vanished. Mouth vanished. Only folds, hollows, and ridges remained on the surface of the gelatinous body, which continued to grow, fill with light, and take possession of the cell. "You know," Cross began, "something like this could make a magnificent weapon. Just imagine for a moment how our changed troops could rule the seas and oceans against the enemy. They would need no oxygen, no ships. They would be completely self-sufficient, autonomous. A new race, an underwater race." Then the mass made a sound, not a cry, not a groan, a low vibrating hum that seemed not to come from it but through it, from beneath the floor, from the walls, from the thickness of the rock. The same sound Grafe had heard at night. The pulse, the heartbeat of the cavern. The mucus threads on the cell walls trembled and began to lengthen. They reached for the door, for the threshold, for the corridor. "You see," Cross breathed. "It is moving beyond the individual body. It is expanding its network. It is not an organism, it is a colony, a single distributed." One thread touched his boot. Softly, almost tenderly, it circled the toe and moved upward along the shaft. Cross looked down. His face did not change. He was still smiling. Then the thread tightened with a jerk. The boot split along the seam. The thread passed through leather, through sock, through the skin of the foot instantly and almost without sound, like a heated wire through butter. Blood poured onto the concrete. Bright, red, alive. For one moment it seemed to be the only real thing in that cell, the only thing still belonging to the ordinary world. Cross opened his mouth, and the smile was still on his lips when the scream finally broke free. It was high, tearing, nothing like the voice of a scholar who had lectured in Kiel lecture halls. It was the scream of an animal caught in a trap. A second thread, a third, a fourth. They shot toward him from the walls, from the ceiling, from the mass on the floor. Each one buried itself in flesh and pulled toward the center, toward the pulsing, glowing substance that had already flooded half the cell and was approaching the threshold. Cross fell to one knee, his coat soaked with blood and mucus. His spectacles flew off and cracked beneath him. He was no longer screaming but squeezing out short hoarse sounds like barks. The threads wrapped his leg up to the thigh, and before the eyes of Grafe, Mara, and Vogt, who still stood in the corridor unable to turn away, the leg began to change color. Red to pink, pink to whitish, whitish to the same translucence they had seen in Arvid. The flesh softened. The outlines of the boot blurred and merged with the leg, and it became impossible to tell where footwear ended and body began. Cross raised his free hand, the hand not caught by the threads, and extended it toward the door. His fingers shook. His mouth opened and one word came out. Only one, very quiet: help. Grafe acted. He stepped to the door and drove his shoulder into it. The mucus threads stretched across the threshold. One lashed his wrist, burning through the sleeve of his uniform with a slick pain like a touch of hot metal. He did not stop. The door moved. Threads snapped with a wet crack, splashing clear fluid. The bolt slid into place. From behind the door came the final sound of Cross. Not a scream, not a word. A deep wet gurgle, as if someone were drowning in fluid rising from below and within, filling throat, lungs, and mouth. Then the gurgling ceased. Only the hum remained. Low, steady, growing. Vogt sat on the corridor floor, clutching his head in both hands. The empty ampule lay beside him. He rocked like Ng behind her wall in the same monotonous, endless rhythm. Fragments of words spilled from his mouth, broken and repetitive. He did it himself. He went in himself. I told him. I told him not to. Mara stood on the stairs leading upward. Her already pale face had turned completely white. Her arms hung at her sides, but her eyes remained dry and focused, the eyes of a person who had already wept everything out in advance. Up, Grafe ordered. Both of you. Now. He bent to Vogt, seized him by the front of his coat, and dragged him to his feet. The young man swayed but stayed upright. His red, wet eyes darted about. Is he alive? Vogt asked. The professor, is he still? Move, Grafe said, pushing him. They climbed. Vogt went first, clinging to the rail with both hands. Mara followed. Grafe took the rear. Halfway up he stopped and listened. From below, from behind the remaining door of Sector F, through the thickness of stone, came a sound. Not gurgling, not humming, but something new, quiet and scraping. As if the mass inside the cell were searching for a way out, testing the walls for weakness, feeling the hinges flowing into the cracks in the concrete. He turned and continued upward, wiping cold sweat from his forehead with the edge of his sleeve. The terrible image of the professor still stood before his eyes. Everything had become madness, a nightmare. On the landing between levels, Vogt stopped, breathing hard. He braced his hands on his knees and stood that way for several seconds, staring at the floor. Then he straightened, turned to Grafe, and his gray-green, sweat-wet face twisted with a mixture of terror and miserable childlike hope. Maybe the door will hold, he said. Maybe it cannot get out. Steel is steel, 2 centimeters thick. It cannot dissolve steel, can it? It is organic, it cannot. Vogt, Grafe interrupted. Move. The assistant swallowed, nodded, and climbed on. The rail creaked beneath his hands. They emerged onto the middle level. Grafe closed the stair door behind them and slid the bolt. Then he listened. For a few seconds there was only the breathing of 3 people and the distant hum of ventilation. Then from below came a soft, wet sound like adhesive slowly being peeled from skin. Then silence. Keep moving. They walked along the middle-level corridor toward the laboratory. Vogt was first, almost running. Grafe noticed the young man kept glancing at the ventilation grills, dark rectangles set into the walls every 10 meters. From one of them, the third, a thin line of wetness had run onto the concrete, shining in the yellow lamplight. Only condensation, or not only condensation. Vogt saw the line and stopped so sharply that Mara nearly ran into him. Condensation, he muttered. It is condensation. There is damp here. Moisture gathers on metal and runs down. That is normal. It has always been like that. No one answered. They reached the laboratory door. Grafe opened it and let Mara and Vogt inside. Then he entered, closed the door, and turned the latch. The laboratory looked as they had left it. The aquariums glowed along the far wall, the jellyfish pulsing in their lazy rhythm. The chimera in the third aquarium pressed itself against the glass and froze, flattening its shapeless body so that internal structures could be seen through it, dark knots and threads shining through the gelatinous flesh. Vogt went to the work table and sat down, placing his palms flat on the surface. His hands shook and he pressed them harder against the wood, trying to still the tremor. Then they heard it. First, a thin, barely perceptible sound, like fingernails drawn over wet glass. It came from somewhere beyond the door, from the corridor. Then the sound multiplied, becoming many sounds, as if on the other side of the door a dozen fingers were scraping metal and concrete at once. Then to the scraping came a wet slapping, steady and rhythmic, like bare feet on a wet floor. Vogt slowly raised his head and looked at the door. What is that? From beneath the door, through the gap between lower edge and threshold, no more than 4 millimeters wide, gray-blue mucus began to crawl, alive with the same pearly shimmer. It flowed over the concrete in a thin tongue, spreading like spilled water. But water follows gravity, filling dips and hollows. This substance moved differently. It moved with purpose. The tongue of mucus reached the leg of the nearest table, flowed around it, and moved on toward the center of the room. As the mass gathered, tendrils began to rise from it. The first grew straight from the edge of the slimy tongue, rising vertically about 20 centimeters. Thin as a pencil, tapering at the end, it swayed from side to side like a blind worm sampling the air. Then it stretched another 10 centimeters and bent toward Vogt, as if it had sensed him. A second tendril, then a third. They rose from the widening puddle like stems from a swamp, each thick as a finger, wet and translucent, with bluish light showing from within. They lengthened, thickened, branched at the ends, and became tentacles with flat suction-like tips. God, Vogt whispered. He did not move. He sat behind the table, gripping the edge, watching in horror as the mass kept coming from under the door, as the tentacles multiplied and grew. 4, 5, 7. The slime flowed faster. The gap beneath the door was narrow, yet the substance forced itself through like paste from a tube, flattening to the thickness of a sheet of paper, and at once regaining volume on the other side. At the same time, another point of entry appeared in the upper left corner of the door, where the panel did not fit tightly against the frame. A thin filament of mucus seeped through the gap, hung in the air, stretched, and began to thicken, filling with mass from outside. From the filament grew a long flat tentacle like a ribbon. It swam through the air toward the ceiling, gripping concrete with its suckers. Vogt stood. The chair behind him toppled with a crash. He backed toward the far wall, toward the aquariums, unable to look away from the door. The tentacles reached for him, not all of them, only the 3 nearest. They stretched, lengthening before his eyes, and their tips trembled like the fingertips of a blind man reading Braille. "Do not move," Grafe shouted. "Vogt, stand still." But Vogt did not hear, or heard, and could not command his body, which was already acting by itself on pure ungovernable terror. He darted right toward a side passage between the tables, and his sleeve brushed one of the tentacles. Contact lasted a fraction of a second. The tentacle wrapped around his wrist instantly, like a trap snapping shut, soft, tight, with a wet sucking sound. Vogt screamed and jerked his arm. The tentacle did not release. Tightened, and through the sleeve of his coat a dark, wet brown stain appeared. Beneath the cloth on the skin, the substance was already soaking in, entering through pores, through microcracks, through every boundary separating living flesh from unliving matter. A second tentacle struck his throat. A third wrapped his ankle. Vogt fell to his knees, screaming, snarling, shaking his head. He tried to tear the slimy cord from his wrist with his free hand, but his fingers passed into it as into thick jelly and became stuck. The substance flowed up his arm toward the elbow and shoulder, covering, seeping under cloth, adhering to flesh. Where it touched, the skin instantly paled, losing color, becoming waxy and translucent. Grafe stepped toward him and stopped. The distance between him and Vogt was no more than 3 meters, but the space between them was crossed by 5, no, already 7 tentacles growing from the spreading mass on the floor. To touch Vogt meant to touch the substance. He had seen what happened to Cross. He was seeing what happened now. He knew there was nothing to be done with bare hands, and he had no weapon on him. And what use would a weapon have been? Mara stood behind him. She did not scream. She pressed both palms to her face and watched in horror through her spread fingers, the way children watch what they cannot look away from, though every cell of the brain commands them to turn. Her body had gone rigid. Her feet had rooted to the floor, and only a fine tremor passing over her shoulders showed that she was still alive, still here, not yet fallen into merciful unconsciousness. Vogt no longer screamed. He made short, wet gulping sounds as if drowning. Tentacles had woven him up to the waist. His face, the only part still free, was turned toward Grafe. In the young man's wide eyes, red from ruptured capillaries, stood an expression Grafe had seen only once before in his life, in the eyes of a wounded scout in Finland when the man understood that help would not come. "Help me," Vogt forced out. His voice was compressed and wet, as if his throat were already filling from within. "For God's sake, help me." Grafe seized Mara by the shoulders. She did not move. He turned her toward himself, and her wide, sightless eyes looked through him at what was happening behind his back. He took her face in his palms, hard enough to hurt. "Mara, look at me, at me." She blinked, her pupils focused. "Run," he ordered. She did not answer, but her legs obeyed. When he pulled her by the hand, they rushed toward the emergency exit at the far end of the laboratory, a narrow door leading into the technical corridor. Grafe hit it with his shoulder. Behind it was a dark, narrow passage smelling of damp and machine oil. Behind them, the tentacles were turning. Grafe glanced back as he ran. The mass on the laboratory floor had grown fourfold. It flowed from the door in a broad tongue, already occupying a third of the room, curling around table legs, overturning chairs. Tentacles rose from it. Not 7 and not 10. Far more. They grew like bamboo shoots in accelerated film, stretching toward the ceiling, spreading over the walls, gripping pipes and cables. One reached the aquarium with the jellyfish, wrapped around its steel frame and squeezed. The glass burst with a deafening crack and water poured onto the floor. The jellyfish, those pulsing bells with long tentacles, slapped into the collapsing mass. It accepted them instantly, absorbed them, and the glow brightened for a moment as if it had been fed. Vogt was no longer visible. Where he had been stood a mound covered in folds and hollows, still faintly reminiscent of a human figure but already melting, losing outline. One hand protruded from it, the right hand, fingers spread and white as alabaster. The fingers clenched into a fist, opened, clenched again, and froze. Grafe slammed the door to the technical corridor. There was no bolt, only a handle. He grabbed a length of steel pipe leaning against the wall and jammed it between the handle and the wall. It would not stop the thing, but it might delay it. They ran along the technical corridor toward the emergency stair. Mara followed silently. Her shoes struck the grated floor. Her breath came in short, torn bursts. Grafe held her hand and did not let go. Behind them, from beyond the wedged door, came a dull blow. Then another. Then a long scrape like nails on a school blackboard, only louder, lower, with a vibration that carried through the corridor walls. On the stair they collided with 2 technicians running down from above. One, an older man in oil-stained overalls, shouted something, but Grafe did not catch the words. He waved upward toward the exit. "Evacuation. Everyone up. Run." They burst out onto the surface through the main entrance, through the same airlock with the pneumatic door. October air struck his face. Wet, salty, icy. Grafe dragged it into his lungs and stopped for 1 second, holding Mara as she staggered on the wet concrete of the pier. Before them lay the fjord, gray, still, indifferent. The launch rocked at the bollard. Behind them, something began rising from the ventilation shafts cut into the cliff. At first it seemed like smoke, a thin gray stream curling from a square opening in the granite. But smoke does not behave like that. Smoke does not divide into separate chords. Smoke does not feel along the edge of a shaft with flat suction tips. Tentacles were crawling out of the ventilation shafts. Slowly, cautiously, like fingers from beneath a blanket, extending 10, 20, 50 centimeters, swaying in the wind, which seemed unsure whether to be frightened of them. The first tentacle stretched to a meter, swung, opened at the end like a fan, and settled onto the rock surface. Suckers bit into granite. Behind it came a second, a third, a fifth, a 10th. From 3 ventilation shafts at once, dozens of slimy cords crawled, gray-blue, glimmering, wetly shining in the gray light of the overcast day. They spread across the cliff like tree roots, gripping cracks and ledges. One reached the metal canopy above the entrance, wrapped around a support and pulled. The post bent with a faint squeal. A sheet of tin tore from its fastenings and crashed down onto the pier. How could slime possess such strength? Grafe did not know. Two technicians who had run out behind them froze on the pier with their heads tilted back. The older man in overalls slowly backed toward the launch. The second, a young fair-haired one, stood with his mouth open, his Adam apple moving up and down like a piston. Three more emerged from the main entrance. Last came a guard with a carbine, working the bolt as he ran. He saw the tentacles on the cliff, raised the weapon and fired. The bullet passed through the nearest cord without visible harm. At the impact point, the substance parted like dough under a finger and immediately closed again. The guard fired again and again. Each bullet passed through as if through water. One of the tentacles whipped down toward him from above. It dropped from the ledge like a rope and wrapped his neck and right shoulder. The guard dropped the carbine. He grabbed at the tentacle with both hands, trying to tear it away, and his fingers sank into the mucus to the first joint. He screamed. His high breaking voice struck the rocks of the fjord and returned as a tripled, distorted echo. A second tentacle lashed the fair-haired technician across the legs. He fell onto the concrete. The substance flowed over his overalls, soaking into the fabric, appearing on the skin of his hands and neck in wet, shining stains. He beat those stains with his palms, smearing the mucus. Each strike only increased the area of contact. "Onto the launch," Grafe shouted. His voice rose to a cry for the first time. The cry cut the air like a whistle. Everyone onto the launch now. Mara was already aboard. The older technician rolled over the side after her. The helmsman tore the line from the bollard. The engine roared. Grafe stood on the pier for 1 second. He looked at the guard wrapped in a tentacle, at the technician rolling on the concrete. He looked at the tentacles themselves spreading over the cliff. Dozens of them, an entire network, pulsing, growing, alive. They were crawling toward the pier. The leading cords had already reached the edge of the concrete platform and hung over the water, swaying. Then he turned and leapt onto the launch, almost breaking his legs. The launch tore away from the pier. The propeller churned black water. The distance between hull and bollard became 1 meter, then 2, then 5. From the edge of the concrete, one tentacle shot after them. It flew over the water, stretching 1.5 meters, and its flat suction cup tip slapped the surface 0.5 meter from the stern. Water splashed. The tentacle sank and vanished. The launch gathered speed, jumping over waves. The icy wind struck Grafe's face, but now it helped, sobering him from terror. He stood at the stern, breathing hard. The sleeve of his uniform on the left arm was torn from wrist to elbow, and through the tear-showed skin reddened by a thin chemical burn. He examined the arm, bent his fingers, and straightened them. No mucus on the skin. The contact had been too brief. Mara sat on the wet bench, hugging her knees. She was not crying. Her face was motionless and gray, as if molded from wet clay. Only her lips moved soundlessly, like a person repeating the same word. Grafe sat beside her. The launch moved through the fjord, away from the cliff. The roar of the engine made speech almost impossible, but he bent to her ear. "Mara, listen to me. We must destroy the laboratory now before the substance reaches the cavern lake through the lower level. If it joins the colony below with whatever lives in the deep, nothing will stop it." She turned her face toward him. Her pupils were dilated, but her gaze focused, and something conscious returned to it. She closed her eyes for a second, opened them. "What do you propose?" "Fire," Grafe said. "The cryogenic storage on the middle level. Reserves of concentrate at -20. Alcohol and acetone in the closet beside the laboratory. 8 canisters. If the launch approaches the pier at minimum distance, I can go back inside, set fire to the storage room, and get out before the corridor temperature becomes critical." Mara stared at him as if he had just uttered the stupidest words in the world. "Go back there. You saw what is happening outside. Tentacles on the cliff, on the pier. How do you intend to pass?" "Through the emergency tunnel. Western wall. Entrance from the stone ledge above the water. The tentacles are moving from the ventilation shafts. They are on the eastern and northern side. The western entrance may still be clear. If it is not, I will see it and return to the launch. And if the substance is already inside, if it has filled the middle level, I need only the closet with the canisters and the electrical panel. Both are 20 meters from the emergency exit. Enter quickly, short the wires, spread the alcohol, and get out. 3 minutes. Mara shook her head slowly. "I know the positions of the ventilation valves," she said. "If you want fire to spread evenly, you need draft. Open the dampers on the middle level so air flows from the upper shafts down toward the cavern. Without draft, the fire will suffocate in concrete boxes. Without me, you cannot do it. No, you stay on the launch. The valves are manual Hauptstromführer, 4 of them in different parts of the corridor. You will not find them even if I draw a map. They are sunk into the walls and disguised as fire panels. I watched the Todd engineer install them. I am the only one who knows where they are and how they open. Each needs 3 full turns of the wheel counterclockwise and the third turn jams. You have to know how to lift the lock. Grafe looked at her for 3 seconds. 5. Very well, he nodded. Then he turned and ordered the helmsman to turn back. Everyone aboard looked at him with horror, so he had to explain quickly. The launch approached the cliff from the western side. The unterfeld Webble at the wheel gripped the helm and muttered continuously under his breath, either a prayer or a curse. The ledge above the water was narrow, 1 meter wide, with wet stones covered in brown seaweed. The entrance to the emergency tunnel gaped black in the rock, a dark rectangle like an open mouth. Grafe jumped onto the ledge first. The stones slid beneath his feet, but he caught himself against a projection of granite. Mara jumped after him. He caught her by the elbow. The tunnel was empty. No mucus, no shimmer, no sound except the distant hum of a fire that had not yet begun. No, not fire. Ventilation. It still worked, driving air through the arteries of the facility. They entered. Inside was dark. Grafe switched on the lamp he had taken from the launch emergency box. The beam struck concrete walls streaked with moisture. The floor was dry. Air was stale, heavy, with a taste of smoke and the sweet iodine odor that would now forever be associated with this place. They worked silently and quickly. Mara went to open the ventilation valves. Before she disappeared around the bend in the corridor, she turned. 4 valves. I need 7 minutes. Do not leave without me. 7 minutes, Grafe repeated, not 1 second more. Be careful. She nodded and vanished into the darkness. He heard her footsteps receding, quick, precise, without hesitation. Then they faded. Grafe moved the canisters. The closet was exactly where he remembered it, 20 paces from the emergency exit. The door was unlocked. Inside stood 8 canisters, 4 of alcohol and 4 of acetone, lined along the wall in an even row like soldiers on inspection. He dragged out 4 of them, 2 in each hand, and placed them along the corridor at regular intervals. Each canister weighed about 20 kilograms, and with every pull he felt his burned wrist throb. He uncapped the canisters. Alcohol poured over the concrete floor, filling cracks and uneven places, reaching the door of the storage room. The smell struck his nostrils, sharp, familiar, almost home-like against the sweet, sickening presence that soaked the lower level. He opened the cryogenic storage room. Cold struck his face. 4 glass containers of concentrate stood on shelves, each in its cradle. He pulled one out and placed it on the floor beside an opened acetone canister. After a brief hesitation, he threw the others down with it. From the depth of the corridor, from the direction of the laboratory, came a sound. Wet rustling movement, as if someone were dragging a soaked sack along the floor. Grafe froze and listened. The sound repeated closer. He aimed the lamp that way. At the end of the corridor, where the beam lost itself in a blurred spot, something low and flat was moving. It crawled along the floor, hugging the left wall, and its surface glowed with the familiar bluish light. From its front edge rose 2 tendrils, thin, mobile, feeling the air before it. The substance had found him, sensed him somehow. Grafe did not run. He went to the electrical panel mounted on the wall between him and the approaching mass, removed the cover, examined the rows of fuses and terminals, drew a folding knife from his pocket, stripped 2 wires and twisted them into a short circuit. The 20-amp fuse blew instantly. Sparks spilled from the terminals. Come on, Mara, hurry. First spark fell into the puddle at his feet. The alcohol ignited with a low popping sound, and bluish flame ran over the concrete like a living creature let out of a cage. It raced through puddles, leapt over uneven places in the floor, reached the canisters. Acetone caught next, brighter, hotter, with black smoke that instantly filled the upper third of the corridor. The fire reached the first canister. It flared, and flame climbed to the ceiling. Paint on the concrete hissed, bubbled, and began to blacken. Grafe saw the wave of fire race down the corridor toward the crawling mass. The substance stopped. Its tendrils jerked and pulled back into the body like fingers touching a hot plate. The mass retreated, but the alcohol flowed faster. Flame caught the front edge, and the substance hissed, smoked, and curled like egg white on a burning pan. Its glow turned from bluish to yellow, then brown, then went out. The smell became unbearable. Burned protein, scorched flesh, chemical acrid smoke. Heat came as a wall. Grafe fell back toward the emergency exit. The hair on his arms crackled. The burn on his wrist flared with pain. He squinted through smoke that ate his eyes and scraped his throat. From a side corridor, coughing and bent low, Mara ran out. 4 valves, she rasped, all open. Draft is moving. I heard the shafts begin to roar. Grafe seized her by the elbow. We leave now. They ran through the tunnel toward the exit, holding hands. Behind them, flame roared and hot air shoved them in the back like the hand of a giant. The tunnel walls were hot to the touch. Concrete heated from within breathed heat. Somewhere deep inside the facility, something burst with a sharp crack. Then again, and the sound was like distant gunshots. They burst from the tunnel onto the stone ledge. Light hit their eyes, gray and overcast, yet after the darkness of the corridor it seemed blinding. The launch stood a few meters from the ledge. The helmsman held it in place, fighting the current. Grafe ran along the stones and jumped first, then caught Mara. They tumbled over the side and fell onto the wet deck boards. For an instant they lay side by side, face to face, and Mara's fingers gripped his wrist briefly and hard before letting go. Away, Grafe shouted, rising. Full speed. The launch tore away from the cliff. Behind them, smoke poured from the ventilation shafts, black, oily, dense. From the emergency tunnel they had just left, a column of hot air burst out, mixed with sparks and something else. After the fire, a tentacle whipped out of the tunnel, long, charred at the end, still smoking. It fell onto the stones of the ledge, convulsed and went still. Its glow died. The end blackened and curled like a burned branch, then began to melt, consumed by flame. The people aboard said nothing. They watched the cliff behind them. There were too few of them, far too few. Each of them knew someone was missing, but no one spoke the names aloud. Smoke still poured from the ventilation shafts, black, oily, heavy. It spread over the water like fog. Now and then orange and dark red flashes of flame flickered in its folds, but there was no blue glow, no shimmer, no pulse. The rock was burning. One of the divers, a strong young man, counted people by heads, bending fingers. He counted twice, lost count, began again, then lowered his hands and looked at Grafe. 7, he said, including you and Fraeline Lind. Grafe nodded. The rest had remained in the rock. Kraus, Vogt, Scheffer, the guard Bauer, the technician Bruckner, and 2 more caught by tentacles on the pier, and others who had been on different levels and could not get out. Mara sat on the bench with her head dropped into her hands. Her shoulders did not shake. She did not cry. But her whole body, small and thin in the dirty coat, expressed such emptiness that it was physically difficult to look at her. Grafe awkwardly placed a hand on her shoulder. She did not raise her head. After several seconds, her hand rose and came to rest on top of his. They sat like that for a minute in silence while the launch beat steadily over the waves. One of the technicians, the older man in oil-stained overalls, the same man who had first rolled over the side on the pier, crouched by the rail and vomited into the water. Between spasms, he muttered one name again and again. Bruckner. Bruckner. Karl Bruckner. The technician with acid-burned hands, silent and dead on the stair landing, had been his partner and best friend. Mara shifted closer to Grafe. Her face was covered in soot, and through it showed a bad greenish pallor. Vogt asked us for help, she said suddenly. Grafe was silent. He was a coward, Mara continued. Her voice was level, without anger, without bitterness, like a medical finding. He shook, sweated, looked around all the time. He feared Kraus, feared the substance, feared you. She paused. In Tromsø there will be a commission and investigation, questions. Yes, Grafe said. What will you say? The truth. Professor Kraus conducted an unauthorized experiment. Biomaterial escaped. Fire broke out. The laboratory was destroyed. The guilty are dead. Project Orlia is closed. That is not the whole truth. Mara raised her head and looked at the receding cliff. The smoke above it had thinned. The last shreds dissolved into the low clouds. Nothing burned now, nothing shone, only gray granite, gray water, and gray sky. Hauptsturmführer, she said quietly. He turned. Yes, who are you really? Hauptsturmführer Grafe, I already answered, inspector of the main office. Inspectors do not know where the canister closet is before they enter the corridor, or where the electrical panel is, or how ventilation valves open. Grafe looked at her. The fjord wind stirred the strands of hair that had escaped her knot, now covered with ash and soot. I am the man who burned the laboratory, he said. That is quite enough. The corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly, and for an instant she saw something different in his face. Not an inspector and not an officer, just a very tired man. Mara was silent for a long time. Then she nodded once slowly and turned back to the water. The launch headed for Tromsø and the wind strengthened. To the west, beyond rocks, beyond clouds, beyond the line of the horizon that could not be seen, the sun was setting, invisible, unverifiable, accepted on faith like much in this war, like almost everything. They came out of the throat of the fjord into open water. The cliff shrank until it became a dark tooth against the gray sky. The smoke merged with the clouds. After 10 minutes, nothing on the surface of the sea indicated that anything had ever existed in those rocks except stone. Grafe fastened the button of his uniform and ran a hand over his hair. As if by chance, he touched the inside pocket, checking that everything was in place. There were copies of the professor research, secret data that would go to the leadership. His face again took on the same worn, impassive expression with which he had stepped onto the wet pier that morning. Hauptsturmführer Elias Grafe of the SS, inspector of the Reich Security main office, was returning from an assignment. And the man named Mikhail Sergeyevich Voronin, captain of the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff of the Red Army, call sign Raven, continued his war. Invisible, soundless, marked on no map. The launch moved toward Tromsø. The wind died and the sea smoothed. Far behind, in the black depth of the flooded cavern, where the fire had not reached, and where no bomb would ever reach, faint blue lights continued to shimmer. They pulsed in their ancient, inhuman rhythm, patient and indifferent to everything that happened above. They waited.